International Reports. Around the World with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation.
Hello and welcome to another edition of International Reports. I'm Eric Olander. When we talk about European colonialism, typically the first thing that comes to mind is the subjugation and conquest of millions of people in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. And for a lot of people, colonialism is something of the distant past. Well, it isn't, because the legacy of colonialism is as relevant today as it was decades ago, given that many of the recent conflicts around the world, everything from the Thai-Cambodia border clash that took place in July to the confrontation in May between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, and of course the ongoing Israel-Palestinian crisis, all trace their roots back to European colonialism. And we also see this play out on social media, where Russian and Chinese propaganda are framing these conflicts, particularly between the Israelis and Palestinians, as a continuation of the anti-colonial struggles of the 1960s and 70s. But it's interesting, though, that amid all of these discussions around the legacy of European colonialism, Russia's own imperial history is largely overlooked. Of course, this isn't surprising, given that Russia's imperial history doesn't really fit very well with Moscow's West versus the rest narrative that drives so much of the Kremlin's messaging. But we're going to talk about it today and look at the history of Russian colonialism, specifically in Central Asia and the Caucasus, with a particular focus on the South Caucasus region. Now, if you're not familiar with this part of the world, try and picture this. It's a very small region sandwiched in between Russia to the north, Turkey and Iran to the south, and squeezed in between two large bodies of water with the Black Sea to the west and the Caspian Sea to the east. Right in the middle of that little space are three very strategically located countries: Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Well, let's get a perspective now on the history of Russia's role in this region and what the situation is today. That's all detailed in a fascinating article in International Reports, Russia as a Colonial Power in the Caucasus, A History of Oppression, written by Stephan Malerius, who's head of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's EU Projects Department, and Florian Binder, a scientific associate at the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Regional Program Political Dialogue South Caucasus. Stephan, Florian, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on International Reports.
Thank you, Eric, for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Eric.
Florian, I'd like to start with you because you've spent a lot of time in this region. And again, this is a part of the world that I think a lot of people may not be familiar with. Before we get into the article and the history that it has with Russian colonialism and Russia as a whole, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the people, the place, the geography, and why this region and these three countries are so important.
Yeah, so the South Caucasus has been always kind of between the crossroads between East and West. It is, as you already said, kind of squeezed in between a plethora of important players in world politics, and it has historically been kind of the transit point between where the Silk Road went through, and kind of every empire that ever wanted to expand east or west had to go through the South Caucasus. And so this has created, a situation where the three countries there, as you said, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, have had a long history of being especially dominated by Russian colonialism. And now, since, the end of the Soviet Union, have been vying for their freedom and their liberty and their chance to develop freely and independently. And still, all kind of major global powers have a vested interest in this region, that it has two seas, mountain ranges, and connects possibly north and south and east and west again. And nowadays it is still the Russians who are the largest player there, trying to rebuild kind of their colonial empire in the region.
Stephan, Florian has talked about this long history, and he's mentioned colonialism, and it was, of course, in the title of your fascinating article. It's quite a provocative title, A History of Oppression. And when we think of colonialism and colonial powers, typically, again, as I mentioned earlier on, we think of the Germans or the French or the Italians, the Portuguese, but the Russians don't usually come to mind. But you suggest that it should in the article. Tell us about why you're defining Russia as a colonial power in this part of the world.
Well, the article is basically describing the Russian presence in the Caucasus, the North and the South Caucasus throughout 200 years. And we start with describing the wars that the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire in the 19th century fought in the North Caucasus in particular. Basically, back then, the Tsarist Empire described itself as a colonial power. So the intentions, the Russian intentions in the 19th century were colonial intentions. And then we come to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was present in the South Caucasus from 1990, 2021, crushing period of independence of the three countries that we mentioned, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And then was Russian dominated, was colonializing the three countries and North Caucasian nations and tribes as well over 70 years. The difference during the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire was that the Soviet Union, framed its presence there as bringing civilization to those countries, and especially in the beginning, giving them space to self-determine. But in fact, we saw the pattern of Russification, economic exploitation, and political repression over 70 years of Soviet rule there as well.
Yeah, and just to be clear on our terms here, you've talked about the Russification, you've talked about the control, but when you talk about this word colonial, again, a lot of people have one definition for it and what they've seen in Africa and other places. What is your definition of colonial in this context?
Actually, you can take three major aspects. The first is the political domination combined with repression. So if the subjugated nations are not adhering to what you're prescribing, then they are repressed. Second is economic exploitation and cultural domination. Are the three characteristic figures for describing a colonial power. We see a lot of similarities between how the Western colonial powers in Africa or Asia, the British Empire, the French, Belgium, or the Netherlands behaved with how Russia behaved in Central Asia and the Caucasus.
And I think one thing, maybe to chime in there very quickly, is also that this is not necessarily, us introducing the term of colonialism in this region. This is something that the people in the region, especially in Georgia, for instance, have been talking about, have been classifying themselves as a post-colonial nation for a very long time. And so it is, on the one hand, as Stephan rightly says, that we see these patterns historically that are very similar, from kind of signing protective treaties to this economic exploitation, etc. But it's also that it is in the region itself the narrative or the framework that is being used to describe the history of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan.
That being said, Florian, and just to pick up on what you have written in the article itself, there is not a consensus on that. And let me just quote from the article, and I'd like to get your expansion on this. If Armenia, by contrast, the dominant narrative long portrayed Russia and the Soviet Union more as a protective power than a colonial one. Talk about that discrepancy.
Yeah, so in Armenia, there has always been, or for a very long time, had been this narrative which was also pushed by the Soviet Union very, very strongly, and by the Russians until today, that, without Russia's protection, and I would compare this to the protection that a crime syndicate offers you as well, where you pay up and then you get protection. Without that, the Armenian statehood would have ceased to exist, and also that, Russia saved Armenia from the Armenian genocide in 1915. Now, that has been starting to be questioned in Armenia, especially since 2020, because the Russians have also used this narrative to claim that they are the only ones who protected Armenia still from Azerbaijan and Turkey, and this kind of guarantor of peace in Karabakh, etc. And so then when Armenia and Azerbaijan fought the Second Karabakh War, and in the developments after that, the Russians were completely absent, and they didn't come to fulfill this protective role that they were supposed to have played. And so this is why in Armenia also now the perception is changing. And maybe Stephan wants to add something to that.
Yeah, and protection is not only a present to Armenia or to the nation, but it is combined with domination. If you look at the Armenian economy, railway system, gas pipelines, atomic power station, everything is owned actually by the Russians. So the Russians created over the last 30 years a kind of system of economic dominance that is paired with making the country dependent on itself.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about colonialism, there's oftentimes a reaction to it, an anti-colonial movement, as we've seen through time. Is there today evidence of anti-colonial struggles, or that the same type of anti-colonial struggles that we saw in the 60s and 70s playing out today to resist Russian influence and Russian power in that region?
Yeah, well, I mean, very vividly in the protest movements in Georgia over the last two years, the presence of Russian-backed, increasingly authoritarian government in Georgia that is crushing down on civil society, on free media, and limiting the space for expression and association, assembly, and so on. That is confronted with accusations that this is a colonial attempt of the Russian, and a new colonial attempt of the Russian to sort of make Georgia again very dependent on Russia. After a period of the country in which we saw the country moving towards Europe and towards the West, and trying to be integrated in the European Union and the Western alliances, which is something that Russia, with its colonial imperial intention, could not accept.
What's interesting to me is how long the trajectory of time that you're talking about that this is going on, in terms of going all the way back to the Tsarists, into the Soviet era, and as you've detailed now, even in the Putin era. But yet you identify in the article that there is a gap in the post-colonial discourse that doesn't include Russia. And that very much plays to Putin's advantage, that people are talking about Israel, Palestine as a colonial war, for example, but don't ever put what's happening in the Caucasus in that same context. Stephan, talk to us about the gap that you're trying to fill with this article in the discourse.
Right. I mean, the point to classify Putin's Russia, or the Soviet Union dominated by Russia, as a colonial power is its subject definitely of contention in the academic discourse, but also in the political discourse. But the discourse is having deficiencies, so it is superficial, it's very Western-centric, and there's a ideological alignment between, ideas of Marxism and the post-colonialism, because during the Soviet Union was itself, being a Marxist state, describing itself successfully as an anti-colonial power, withstanding imperialistic ambitions and helping the subjugated nations in their struggle and supporting liberation movement and so on. So a lot of researchers bought this propaganda and this Soviet narratives, as well as today a lot of even politicians are buying what Putin is trying to sell. The weaponizing of history means he's trying to sell manipulative history and false narrative to make a case for himself, or for what his regime is doing worldwide. And obviously Putin is doing propaganda which is nothing is having nothing to do with the historical facts, actually.
Sure. Trump may not be aware of it, but Florian, I'd be surprised if universities in the United Kingdom and France, Germany, elsewhere in Europe that do study quite a bit about post-colonial histories around the world have overlooked this particular region. Why do you think that is?
I mean, Stephan has already mentioned some of the central points. One is you have a very Western-centric debate, meaning that in Western countries, if there is a colonial discourse, which luckily there is now most of the time, It focuses on, your own empire, your own experiences. Simultaneously, voices from colonized countries are still underrepresented everywhere. But the difference is that also in the Russian context, in the Russian colonial context, there is no discourse about this in Russia. There is an anti-discourse about this, as Stephan rightly pointed out, where you have, these propaganda narratives, and the voices from the regions themselves are being silenced with this. And so this means that in Georgia or in Armenia, people have this discourse, academically as well, by the way, but these voices don't really get out of this bubble. And I think this is one of the main kind of efforts our article is trying to make, not to, play a whataboutism game of comparing Western colonialism can't be so bad because there's also Russian one. No, it's giving an opportunity to listen to what the people in the region have talked about a lot already and to kind of fill this gap in the discourse that is there because no one has yet penetrated this space here.
And Florian, I'm going to give you the last word. What do you want people to take away from this article?
Yeah, maybe to just quickly also talk about what reactions I expect, because I want to paint a bit more of a positive picture. Is I agree that it will be difficult, but I think one thing that we have been very aware of and sensitive towards is what we are saying in this article is backed by historical facts. Right, there is kind of no possibility to deny that the Russians have behaved very similar to other European colonial powers, and that there should be the start of a kind of a thought process there. And I think that anyone who is reflective in their kind of convictions, which I think still exist, can take this as an opportunity to broaden their horizon and to also maybe engage with the people that we are trying to give a stage for. You don't have to, talk with us about if you think Russia is a colonial power or not. Yeah, we are not victims of this colonialization. You should talk with the people who have experienced this. And this kind of article is also an invitation to, speak with Georgians, speak with Armenians, speak with Azeris, to engage with this difficult topic and then to profit from it in return. Because when we look at post-colonial, reparation efforts, this needs to be a holistic discourse where we can learn from each other. And I think this is also what we're trying to do with this article, not to start a polarized debate, but to add another kind of element to come to a more holistic picture.
Well, it's an absolutely fascinating article. Russia as a colonial power in the Caucasus, a history of oppression, by Stephan Malerius, who's head of Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's EU Projects Department, and Florian Binder, a scientific associate at the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Regional Program Political Dialogue, South Caucasus. Stephan, Florian, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and to walk us through this very complicated yet very important topic.
Thank you very much, Eric, having us.
Thank you, Eric. And you said that title perfect.
Wonderful. Well, we'll be back again next month with another edition of International Reports. On behalf of the entire team at the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, I want to thank you for watching and for listening, and thank you for joining us today. Thanks so much. Bye for now.